If you need big hair, I'm there. 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 If you need big hair, I'm there.
This is an NBC News Bulletin.
This program contains the truth and is void where prohibited, taxed, or otherwise restricted by law. Do not fold, spin, or mutilate this program. Vyzygoth's Grassy Knoll continues.
All right, a lot of you have responded in two ways with regard to the interview that Andy Colvin did with Baker. One, it went over positively, and I think as listeners you can tell that Judyth Baker was responding to some of the questions, well, not some of them, but was responding very interestedly in what Andy asked of her, which are questions you don't hear involving her and and Oswald. I mean, this was something entirely different. So as much as it was positive and interesting, some of you also evinced a certain kind of need of some background because you didn't know where Andy was coming from, and neither did I. But I'm listening to this because I know that there were some questions that really were on his heart that he wanted to ask, and he did do that. So this wasn't your father's interview with a principal in the JFK assassination. That's what makes it good. So just in deference to some of you who are trying to put that together without having any kind of a deep or even shallow background, I've asked Andy to come back on. He's been good enough to do such. But, I mean, that was a coup by Andy, and I would like to also help out some of the listeners who were interested enough to say, listen, I'm just a little lost here, you know, as I was, but I talked to Colvin for years now. I'm always lost. So at any rate, after that little swipe, Andy, I don't know where you want to take off first with this, but, you know, let me ask you this, because I think this is a little bit more poignant. You're okay with talking about it. I appreciate it. You know, it's never going to leave you, but you get some kind of emotional distance. And that is, there was something with your dad. And I don't mean to cheapen this. Let me say this to you, too. There's times when you talk about what happened there, when it almost makes me feel like it's eerily alike, I think, to what you hear Mulder was saying about his dad. Do you know what I mean?
You mean on X-Files?
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, I'm not trying to cheapen this, but
right.
The two of you remind me of protagonists that know something wasn't right. And your dad was involved in government work. You would not call him a spook, would you?
No. He took a lunch pail to work every day, and did not wear a suit or anything. I mean, wore just like that weird gray, those weird gray outfits that they used to wear at Carbide. That was what he wore. Kind of like I don't know what you even call it. They kind of look like mechanics outfits or something.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll be honest with you, I remember my dad too. It seemed like the industrial issue clothing during that period, 50s and 60s, was like industrial drab gray,
Yeah.
But, I mean, he was involved with something, and can you just say why you feel that he might have gotten something on him, if you know what I'm saying? Why he might have been a victim of some kind of splashback or something involved in the work that he was doing at the time?
Yeah, well, it's complicated because I'm not sure if I got the true story. Because, I guess the cover story was they were making polyvinyl chloride, fluoride, poly this, poly that at the Blaine Island plant, South Charleston plant, also called in West Virginia, at the Carbide facility. So, but, if you look up the history of Carbide, that's the rare minerals plant. So, well, what the heck are they doing, with this other stuff, making this other stuff? Like they purified rare minerals, which doesn't really sound like a poly PVC operation. Mm-hmm. He was on the tech softball team, which would be the tech center. We've recently found out they had an atomic reactor. Could have been the first one ever. It was totally secret. Did they have, who knows what they were doing there? I think they could have been building early drone craft. I mean, my dad, when he was in Norfolk during the Philadelphia experiment, he was, it looks like he was going to DC and Philadelphia a lot, and probably was putting magnetic compasses in new ships, because that was what, if you were loaned out to the National Bureau of Standards, you were probably working on magnetic compasses. I got this from Jacques Vallée. Mm-hmm. So, and then he worked on fighter jets on the USS Roosevelt. So he knew everything about engines. I mean, he was a total whiz with engines, and then he was also got into electrical engineering later. So it wasn't just the engines themselves, it was the electrical systems. And then his cover story was he was working in chemicals. So how can somebody do all these things?
Yeah.
And I would just wonder if they weren't, I mean, based on his previous history, he would have been good for working on flying saucers. If they were trying to build them, he would have been great for that.
All right. Do you have is one of the speculations that you have that he could have been used to work in a certain part of a greater project, which he never knew about the whole of which he was developing one of the parts? That could have been something like you said, whether it was anti-gravity craft or whatever.
Or atomic power within the craft. Because the nickel that they had, if they were, they were the place that could do nickel. Nickel is used in all these atomic projects for the spinners that make the refine the uranium, and for the neutron bomb head casings, and probably the casings for whatever in a drone that is, if it has an atomic power source inside. Those kinds of casings with Carbide, that would be right up their alley. Does that answer it, or?
Well, I was going to take it one more step, and I mean, I think you gave us as much as you could because you're still in the dark about this somewhat. But as it relates to the interview you did with Baker, didn't you ask her about a certain kind of sarcoma that you think your father, or know that your father had developed?
Yeah. Angiosarcoma, which a lot of the Carbide people were getting. And the federal government stepped in I think 71, right when he got it, to do a study, and then they just basically did a whitewash. And I don't know, I don't know if it's people are still getting it there, or if that was, because of the rareness of it, it just made me start wondering right off the bat a long time ago, especially given the description he gave of this being jabbed 2 different times, or feeling like he had been jabbed in 2 different places and getting cancer in both of those places. I figured, they must have been taking people out with this somehow.
When you say jab, I mean, was it something where he could have been pinpricked?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, like a needle. So in the leg and then in the back. After they took it out of his leg, then he got it in the back, and it came on with a jab in the middle of the night. And we do have these weird dreams or nightmares. Me and my sister of having men in black coming in the house and stuff, and that's a part of the Mothman lore, that these home invasions are going on. And I just wonder if we weren't all drugged and maybe they came in and did that to him. We know, well, my other sister definitely remembers the house being searched at night twice. I mean, it was not even a dream. She's the oldest one, and twice she said people were in the house looking for stuff.
I mean, was this something like she was listening from upstairs? I mean, like she's supposed to be in bed or something like that, and all this starts to happen. So
No, they came in her bedroom.
Oh.
And she acted like she was asleep. This is when she was like 5 and then I think 9.
And they left her alone.
And they left her alone. They were just looking for something.
Did she ever say your mom and dad were speaking in duress, or did she hear any of that? Well, I mean, hell, it's their house. I think they know if there was somebody there.
Oh, yeah. Well, my dad was paranoid. My dad was paranoid about, and he had a nighttime ritual. He locked all the doors. Whenever we left the house to go anywhere, he would sometimes go back in again and check everything.
All right, one last question about this, and I'm just curious. Was there any kind of concern by the government / MIBs that maybe workers were spiriting home some stuff that they shouldn't have been? Was that ever a consideration?
That was something that he said. Yeah, he definitely told me that guys were sneaking out stuff to make bombs with.
It's one of the perks of the job. Oh,
well, it was during the strike, or right after the strike, or before the strike. I can't remember exactly, but this is definitely when Mothman was being seen.
If you're going to blow up the plant, why not do it with their own stuff?
Well, we had to evacuate, and so we had to evacuate the house one night because of a big leak, and I naturally started asking questions about it all, and he said, well, they're concerned that somebody, the people are sneaking stuff out in their lunch pails. And of course they were, but it probably wasn't to make a bomb. I mean, I think that was probably just company BS to crack down on everybody.
All right. One last question, like I really promised. Were they ever near or working with beryllium?
I don't know. My dad had a chemistry. He had a molecular chart in his shop, and he had all kinds of jars of weird chemicals.
No, I mean just 'cause
no beryllium.
Because that was a factor. That was supposedly during the 40s the triggering part of the compound and the triggering mechanism for the atom and bombs, which was related to me by the grandnephew of Michael Delisle. Oh, help me out here. He was a Jesuit-trained priest who got defrocked. Delisle Lyons, that's it. Michael Delisle Lyons. Tremendously brilliant guy. But what happened was he was sent to Asia and stuff to look for beryllium deposits. And when he got back to the United States, I believe it was in Colorado, in fact, when he was working with this stuff, it was just ironic that supposedly a man of peace, a priest in the Jesuit order, wound up being involved with a weapon of mass destruction. Or at least, I guess that is a legitimate weapon of mass destruction. And then what happened was his work on that bomb killed him because he died of beryllium poisoning. And that's one of the things that I've asked sometimes of WTC researchers and Matthew Tartaglia, who was there with the search and rescue, saying that there was an amount of beryllium that was loosed. Now, was it what? From cars and their brakes, which beryllium's in there too, or was beryllium used somehow in, the whole WTC event? I might even ask Dave from Blimp 9/11. I'm not sure, but anyway, I just wondered if that's it. Now, you asked her about the sarcoma that what affected.
Well, no, I don't know that he had angiosarcoma. I don't know if they even said what he had. Did they even admit he had cancer? I think they did.
Oh yeah.
No, she was saying that that angio is transmitted by the bloodstream, which I'm not sure what the significance exactly is of that is. I guess the only way muscles can get cancer would be for it to come in through the blood vessels. Although, what if you got an injection? I mean, I don't know that I don't know if she understood my question or what.
That's okay. I'm looking at something because I don't want to drop names and be wrong about this, but there's a reason why I asked you.
Well, I asked her about it because she's the person who developed the cancer weapon. I mean, I don't even know if there was a lot of things unexplained. We didn't really explain that she was there for Oswald's 72nd birthday, for instance. I don't know that we explained that she was the person that weaponized cancer, or one of the people. She actually said that there were a lot of people doing it, other projects. All
right. Again, I don't like to be sloppy about this. I think I got this right. Take it for what it's worth. But a while ago, my brother-in-law, who is a musician in Manhattan, and I guess travels in some circles that are a little exclusive at times, had gone to a wedding. I believe it was for Colby's son. Colby, the director of the CIA.
Yeah.
And the son may be in the company as well. But what was talked about, and this is what he related to me, and again, this guy doesn't throw crap. I mean, he's in a world where he doesn't really care about any of this stuff. But when he heard stuff, it was like, oh, that's interesting. And there was talk there that whether Colby was involved in it or not, anyway, that Bob Marley was assassinated by a poisoned needle, a pin, stuck in his boot. And so when he inserted his foot in the boot, it was done. And that's why I asked you about the pinprick and stuff like that, because I don't know if they had that capacity to do such then, but it certainly is a method of assassination.
Well, yeah, Judyth would definitely, I think, verify that was the case, because that was what she was doing. She was saying that they used a large bore needle to inject the stuff that she came up with, because the cells were large. But, maybe by the time my dad got it and other people, and now, they've probably come up with smaller bore ways, to inject it or whatever. Even nickel dust. I mean, nickel dust you can just put that on something and that somebody, your victim breathes it or whatever, and they get lung cancer pretty fast. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know how that exactly works. If I guess it just lowers your immune system or something, and if cancer is a virus, I don't know if cancer can take more forms than other than virus, but this is supposedly, according to Judyth and a lot of other people, the big secret of cancer is that it's a virus, and
that's what I've heard too.
And we've been told, and they knew this in the 50s, but they've covered it up since. As part of the war on cancer, the war on understanding cancer, they've obscured everything in order to make more money, probably off of it, and maybe to keep the fear level down. Because if everybody thought it was catchable, they'd be freaking out.
Well, yeah. So
I think all these environmental toxins and things, they lower we all have cancer in our bodies, and it just lowers. But we're fighting it off all the time. So if you get exposed to something toxic, it lowers your immune system to the point where the cancer can take over.
Yeah, it becomes opportunistic, absolutely. I mean, I think you heard, and I don't want to go off on this, but I'm still very interested in this, and that is apparently in Europe, and I think in Italy in particular, some physicians, or some surgeons rather, were using injections of bicarbonate of soda.
Yeah.
to neutralize the thing and starve it, or at least suffocate it or whatever, and I'm like, wow,
it's a pH thing,
that's
too.
Right, there you go, absolutely. And that's why, I feel so bad when people go on, and we have this month of breast cancer stuff, people go on these marches, and it's like, I want to support it in one sense, but it's like, and the people, my God, they're doing it, this is all they know, and it's like they already have the cure, man, they're just not going to let us have it. So,
I'm going to drop the S word here.
Go ahead.
The synchronicity word.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bob Marley. Were you done, by the way, with your last thought?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Every now and then I'll just do a synchronicity test, right?
Okay.
I'll just be looking at a book. I'll open a book to a random page I haven't looked at in a long time, or listen to a talk that I haven't heard. Mae Brussel has these, I don't know, I've got like 600 of her talks, and I guess they're split up into half hours, though, so it's over 1,000. So I'll just pick one and click on it.
All right.
Start listening. And I did that, and it was early 81, I think May of 81. How do you say his name? Aja had shot the Pope.
Oh, yeah, I don't know what his, that.
Ajay.
Was that the crazy Romanian or something in 81 or 2?
Yeah, and it's fascinating to hear her because, this guy was a spook. He was traveling all over the world with no visible source of income. And she's making jokes about how the media is covering this up. They don't know why he was in London. He said he took his orders from London, right? and yet they know the name of the prostitute he slept with in Brussels or something, But they just happen to forget, they poo-poo the stuff he says, or that they can find that's substantial and would prove where he comes from and why he did it. And they'll go into these meaningless details, which half of them are probably made up. But at the same time, and it did get into the Jesuits. I think you might have wanted to get into the Jesuits later, so that'll be a good segue. But because Alexander Haig was trying to sort of take over the Bush or the Reagan. He and Bush were having a little battle after Reagan got shot, because Reagan got shot around the same time.
Yeah, that is true. And what's interesting is that both assassinations were failed, so I don't know what was going on there.
Well, it was an attempt by Haig and the Knights of Malta side, the American side of the church, to pressure the church into spending their money on American companies, on companies that they controlled. And by the way, I just found a link between Massey Energy in West Virginia and good old Dick Cheney. I think it's pretty solid here. I'll get into it later maybe. But, the ownership of Carbide looks British. It's starting to look more British. The ownership of Standard Oil is starting to look more British. Massey, various media companies that control our, since the 40s, it just looks like the British have been controlling our TV, different programming that we've been seeing. There's so much of it is pointing toward the British now that I've got moved away from the Bushfellers to the Crownfellers as my new moniker.
Well, there's an interesting time that's not much written about. The robber barons had pretty much, they were on their way successfully to what would become financial and ergo political dominance in this country. So that was the beginning of the end of your Congress and good people. And at one point before that, I believe, contact was made with the Rothschilds, and there was a partnership that kind of understood on both sides of the pond. They were all going to work for a final goal. And I don't know if the Rothschilds staked Morgan to any money or any of those other individuals, but, clearly there was a connection made, which makes perfect sense to me. And so there you had the real power block created, despite what we all know somewhat on the surface, but people are really oblivious to. And I'll just say one thing that's really interesting, I think. NBC is in 30 Rock, right? I call, Rockefeller's network. And it's on the Today Show and these other NBC supposed news shows that you start to get a certain kind of theme going on. And I mean, NBC just shamelessly lent itself to the coverage of the wedding with, what's-his-face, William, right, and Kate. And then on Halloween yesterday, in one segment, Matt Lauer dresses up as William, Ann Curry, this compassionate empath, dresses up as Kate, and Al was in there, which was kind of funny. And I'm like, what's this about? And his statement was, well, you know, we spent something like 700 days covering the wedding. And I'm like, oh, man. I mean, to me, what that was, it was a wink and a nod and a laugh at Americans, you know? So, and the other thing I was kidding around about, although I don't know if I'm really kidding, is how many commercials now have British voices, you know. It's like, all right, so what's that supposed to mean, folks? If somebody sounds British, that means that people think they're also intelligent. They're more erudite because they have a British dialect.
Yes.
Yeah, so,
and everybody in our society is aping the rich all the time because that's the only way you can get any respect anymore. And so that means, and that's becoming synonymous in their minds with being British, and subconsciously, because that's where the old New York money, you know, that whole thing about the elites in New York adopting this fake British accent way back when, that's an old, it's been around forever, hasn't it? I mean, isn't that kind of what that strange accent that you find among Manhattan?
Well, when you look at early speaking movies in the 20s and the 30s, I mean, if you watch them, and these actors and the way they speak, it's like, are you guys Brits or Americans? You know, old fellow, sorry.
Well, they took Shakespeare. They've got, the British have this history of Shakespeare and the theater and everything, and they've just transferred that over here. And maybe they're the ones who really control Hollywood. I've actually heard that from in different ways through the little movie work I did early on. That's kind of the case, and you'll notice that there's a whole section of Academy Awards reserved for the British. I mean, they have to get a certain amount every year. Their numbers are, the percentage of Brits that are in our programming is way higher than the amount that are actually in our society. The point I was making, though, about this synchronicity thing was on that tape. She's also talking. Mae Brussel is talking about Jamaica, and so that story. Marley had just died. And guess who decides they're going to move to Jamaica all of a sudden? David Rockefeller quits Chase, decides he's going to move or buy a place in the Trial compound in Jamaica. Well, guess who started the Trial compound in Jamaica? William Stevenson, the head of British intelligence, the leader of the XX group, the boss of Ian Fleming and Graham Greene and Roald Dahl. And guess who visited Trial to meet with Stevenson? Albert Osborne. Albert Osborne's the guy who took the bus to Mexico City with Lee Harvey Oswald. I read these things over and over, and I keep forgetting them. But I slipped my mind to ask Judyth about or did I? Did she address the Mexico? Because that was the trip that Lee was making for them to plan their escape. He may have made two trips, but he was delivering the vaccine. Or not the vaccine, the weapon, the cancer weapon, to a contact in Mexico City that was going to be taken to kill Castro with, and the contact never showed up, and that's when Oswald knew that he was in trouble because they didn't come to pick up the weapon, and he's like, well, we went through all this trouble, weaponizing this shit, and nobody's even going to use it. Well, this whole thing must be a charade. My point is that you have a direct connection there with Oswald and British intelligence. But
I'm thinking with this mission, that this failed mission more or less, that he realizes this is not going to happen. It seems also reminiscent of what Joan Mellon wrote about with his appearances in Louisiana. It's like he's being run around on, quote, errands, because he is obviously involved with some spook agencies, correct? All right. And he's being run around in places to do things, which is obviously his task. And all the time, this is my inference is, all the time he is being, quote, remembered. And so when they finally come out with this nut Oswald who's killed the president, everybody's like, oh, yeah, okay, I saw him here, and I saw him. You know what I mean? It's the case of being remembered. And that's why I asked Baker, were there, I don't mean doubles like somebody, obviously, I'm talking about lookalikes, and that's the way I posed it to her. Were there some lookalikes around that were, I'm wondering if one of them was in the Holiday Inn scuffle that he was supposedly involved with. And one at a shooting range there was a scuffle. Was this Lee, or was it someone that looked enough like Lee? And, of course, again, they get remembered. They pull that same MO with 9/11 and the hijackers who, for supposedly devout Muslims, certainly had some strange behaviors. And what happened? They got remembered so that as soon as that day happened, everybody went, oh, yeah, that's right. I knew there was something with them. I mean, you understand, right? All right, so, I'm wondering if that's what they were doing with him. And then they created a backstory to Oswald as soon as he was fingered for the assassination. And here we got this thing. Well, he was in Mexico, and he was here, and he was there. You see, this isn't normal stuff. And it isn't. But that's what he was told to do. What the hell does the CIA and the FBI do that is normal? So that's one of the not concerns, but that's one of the, questions I had.
Well, the book, Were We Controlled, which, has some, I guess, fanciful notions in it perhaps, but they make a good point that Oswald went to London before he went to Russia. And he was supposed to be going to college in Switzerland at the Albert Schweitzer School, and where he was going to work on his German. And somebody changes his mind in London, and he ends up going to the Soviet Union, maybe. That may be what happened. That's what they say. Or maybe he just had to fly through there to get to Helsinki. Who knows? But, that's where James Earl Ray went after his, when he was on the run. Brussels says that the orders for the Jonestown massacre came out of London. I don't know exactly what her source was.
Brussels said that?
Yeah. So she was kind of on a London rant that day. It's not just London, maybe. It's also the Germans, because those are so closely intertwined, the German and British monarchies, as we saw this recently with the Queen making this decision about the firstborn girl can now be the Queen. If it's a girl, she gets chosen. And in those articles recently, they do mention how closely, how if certain decisions hadn't been made, we'd have a German Queen of England or King of England right now. Or she would have ended up in quote as a backwater princess in Germany if they hadn't made a certain decision way back when. So that's how closely they are aligned they are. So therefore, you can't. When Mae Brussel goes after the Nazi International for all this stuff, she's also, I think, in her mind, including the British, or at least some aspect of the British, of the monarchy that's in league with the Germans. And they've certainly made out well in the post-war world, the British. These companies. Dutch Shell owns Massey Coal, by the way. There's so many of these companies that we think are American. All the companies that started the soap operas, Colgate, Palmolive, Procter & Gamble, Lever Brothers, they're all British in origin, started by Brits. Mm-hmm. And they brought us, think about the power of soap operas, how just those alone have changed the nature of the way women think in America throughout this whole period of women's rights and everything. What the hell are these soap operas propagating? It's not good, I don't think. There's a classism in the soap opera, not to get off on the soap operas or anything, but there's definitely a British angle to the soap operas. There's always a manner, there's always a rich family in these soap operas that sounds British, just about every one of them. Yeah. And they, I think there's a lot going on there subconsciously with that programming.
I'm so happy that women have decided to take the very I think, assume the ostentatious practice of having hyphenated names. You know, it's like if you don't want to take your old man's name, don't do it. But I mean, how many times do I have to look at, like, you know, Schiff Barrington? It's like, get out of here with this, will you? Get almighty. You know, and I had to laugh too, because when I go through some of these files, when I do some part-time work for claims and such at universities, the only hyphenated names I come to are female faculty members. And I'm like, okay, look, one name to a pair of pants, all right? Anyway, I just want to let you know something too. I looked this up, and I'll put this link up. Some of the stuff you were talking about too, one of the more interesting groups that does not get any attention, I do not believe they sit on top of the dung pile, but they are probably a little bit more heavy duty than we're led to believe, is the Pilgrims Society. Now, what I find interesting is that, what's his face? Quigley, Carol Quigley, you know, wrote all about the Rhodes Roundtable and such, but he never said a thing about the Pilgrim Society, and they sprang up at the same time that Rhodes's Roundtable, later Milner's Kindergarten, popped up around 1904 or so. You don't hear anything about the Pilgrim Society, and I ordered 3 books through interlibrary loan. One was a story about them, a bit of an expose, and 2 were authorized biographies, if you will. One written by a member, one written by a woman, and it was a beauty piece. But I mean, when these cats get together, you don't hear about it. And there was a steady train of American politicians like, what's his name? Kissinger, not Charles Schultz, I love that, right? Joe Schultz. And they were going to the Inn of Middle Court. And when you got to the Inn of Middle Court, they wouldn't tell you what the theme of the lecture was. You never heard of what the topic was. The other ones you could find out about. There's 3 courts over there. And I just found it interesting. Now, having said that, what I find really funny is that the emblem of the Pilgrim Society in its various stages throughout the years is like some kind of almost like character out of Chaucer's, you know, like, I don't know, the Miller or something like whatever, who's on a horse or walking a horse in either motif, on a horse, and that's the British side of it, and there's an eagle involved in it, which I assume, is a symbol of us involved in that Pilgrim Society. But what I had to laugh at is that the eagle sits on the horse's ass. So I don't think that that's a coincidence.
The reference to could be a reference to a messianic reference. The
eagle?
Like Christ. Well, no, yeah. In my mind, the eagle can be a reference to the Messiah, if it's the Thunderbird or the Garuda. In the old days, it's been morphed into the eagle, of course.
Well, I'll say this: you're absolutely right, and most of that you'll find in the Old Testament. However, it's really more magisterial in that it would be an eagle mounted high on a mountaintop. You know what I mean? Mount up with wings as an eagle. Yeah, I mean, not on a horse's ass.
Well, that's Christ on the donkey, right?
Yeah.
Kind of. I mean, it's
you're right.
It's an inversion of the it's the duality, the polarity of a Messiah in a way, is that they're not just majestic. They are also down to earth and with the people and can relate to the people, and then so they'll have symbols like that are not grand, representing an aspect of the Messiah, and that's why I think Mothman appeals to these down home folks and gives them pieces of the puzzle.
Before I go any further, I'll just say this. I'll put the link up at the audio. Take a look, if you will. There was a really good piece written by Charles Savoie, and that's spelled Savoie, not like the theater, on silver-investor.com. And that's what led me to go get the books on the Pilgrim Society and find some of the interesting things there. And no, Andy, I'm not poo-pooing at all your description of that. I just find that these characters are probably satanic anyway. So, it could be a backhanded slap at Christ as well. You know?
Well, is that that's the British Society you're talking about, right? Using that symbol.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and like I said, you can find that in different manifestations. They modernized it as time went on, and one of the more modern ones, by the way, also is in one of those 3 books, like I said, that I came upon, 2 of which are written, to uphold the Pilgrim Society in its best light. The other thing I have to tell you also, which I find interesting, if you look at the original cover of the book, The Wizard of Oz, now there's the Tin Man, and now I'm doing this from memory, okay? There's the Tin Man, and there is the Straw Man, the Scarecrow, sitting on each side of Dorothy. So what are we missing? If you got the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, what character are you missing? And in this book cover, away from all 3 of them, up in the right-hand corner, is a lion, but in the manifestation of the British Griffin. All right? Not vertical, but horizontal, as if walking. But it is no doubt a manifestation of the Griffin. And, I just find that interesting because you've got a book here that was heavily allegorical. There's several levels of The Wizard of Oz. One is theosophic, and one of them was the whole story about the battle for bimetallism against monometallism, and that is gold and silver or just gold. So that was another story about that, hence the yellow brick road being gold. And in the book, Dorothy's slippers are not ruby, they're silver.
And you've got that old thing with one of Maeterlinck's stories involving, from the 20s or 30s, involving an Alec from Russia who shoots the president from a grassy knoll. Yeah, there's a story by Maeterlinck. I don't know if it's the Bluebird. I think it may be a different one, but he wrote the Bluebird, which some people say the Bluebird programming,
all right,
or Monarch programming is based on. And he wrote. I'm pretty sure it was him. It had an Alec from Russia who is like a false flag spy coming and shooting the president from a grassy knoll. That's in the story. And I believe that was Peter Levenda that mentioned that on one of the shows. I was surprised to hear that because it means that they took a template, probably British intelligence again, cooking up the template for Oswald. And it's funny that you were mentioning that eagle motif, the poverty mound. We talked about poverty mound in Louisiana. It has this bird sitting on a mound. If you see from the sky, looks like a bird sitting on a mound. Well, you got the same thing at the Berlin airport. When Hitler designed that, it looks very similar to Poverty Point. Is it Poverty Point? Poverty Point in Louisiana. It's the old Morris symbol of the bird or the thunderbird. And the Nazis hijacked that, and it was on a show. They've been having some shows lately, Nazi collaborators on the military channel and shows like that, and just horrific stories. My last post on Facebook had to do with this. It's like you've got. They're herding people off to the camps, and then they're shooting them and dropping them into trenches. And there's, like a 5-year-old boy and an 80-year-old, his grandfather. They're shooting them together, and the old man's trying to comfort the boy. Yeah, they're going to shoot us in the head any minute now. Can you? This is why I think Mothman, to get a little spiritual here, is continuing to appear. And he actually started being seen in World War II. As soon as the Nazis came up with their Foo Fighters, people were seeing this Birdman flying around. Now, maybe that was a Valkyrie who was ushering the dead off into the afterlife. Maybe it was both. But, that this spirit or whatever, I think the millions of dead people that were murdered like this in these horrible ways, so it's just unthinkable that you would have to die that way. That energy is still out there and it's still waiting for justice, I think, and that's why this creature continues to be seen. It continues to be seen in ways that reveal who did it and why. And I think I think people are really making a mistake if they don't think this is a real that it's possible, because I think it is possible. The energy of the crimes, energy released or whatever, the emotional trauma of that many deaths done in that way, it's still rippling through through our psyches and coming back out again.
Well, I'll just say from a biblical point of view, it is not necessarily couched that way. But yeah, I believe that. I believe that's why vengeance will be great when that day comes for such things to have been avenged, and especially of children. That is like the biggest no-no, which is one of the reasons why too that the occultists have their celebrations in their worst possible way with children. And if you want to get down to it, let's face it, they want young virgins, a.k.a. Joan Benet Ramsey.
Yeah, I heard a good explanation of this, and I may have mentioned it before on one of the shows, but I think Bob Brightbill was talking about this, about how they're doing a reverse tree of life, and they're starting life off for these bloodliners with death instead of it coming at the end. And Bohemian Grove is apparently laid out this way. The camps are in this reverse tree of life order, starting with death. And so they traumatize them right off the bat so that they lack empathy, so that they can go through life lacking compassion enough to be able to continue the program that led to the Nazis. I mean, it's essentially the same thing. It's like that's how you keep people in power and amassing enormous amounts of profit is by having their compassion gene turned off. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So he thinks that there's just, thousands of people being programmed like this all the time for future work in high places.
Like I said, I had no problem with that. I've never heard of Maeterlinck, but I'm going to get on that because that's very interesting.
A couple of other things we talked about during the show that people may have been wondering about was I asked Judyth about Philadelphia. These are things that came up on her list, which are recent little pieces of information that, they don't get a lot of play at all in the JFK story. Oswald possibly visiting Philadelphia and going to a Quaker rally. Oswald visiting the Atomic Museum in Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
So what was his real purpose, for instance? Do you know why he shows up at a Quaker rally?
Personally, he may have been sent there. He may have been sent there by the conspirators. He may have gone there on his own to check out the Paines and figure out, because that's where they were from, and what was the whole Council of Nine thing about. He may have been checking out Albert Osborne, who claimed he was from Philadelphia, but Osborne really was from England. And he ran an assassination team out of Mexico, out of Oaxaca, but he also ran it out of Knoxville, Tennessee first, before they drove him out for being a pedophile. So he has an assassination team in Knoxville, which is guess where the Atomic Museum is, in Knoxville. So I think Oswald was meeting Osborne or trying to research the whole situation.
Could it possibly be that he had to get rubbed out, Oswald, because of what he had been doing and what he might have known through some of these, some of these missions that he was on or sent to by his superiors? Could he have gotten involved in something? You talk about now Paine is associated with the Nine. Is that true?
His father-in-law started the Nine in at least in America, along with Puharish, Arthur Young. And I believe Judyth mentioned Arthur Young, that when Oswald came back to the United States, that they used the fake name Arthur Young for the INS guy that signed him in or something. Do you remember that?
Do you consider the Nine extremely dangerous?
Well, I don't know. It's an outgrowth of the old Theosophy movement, and their goal, I think, has just been to cover up this exotic aircraft development by cooking up stories of aliens.
But that made me at least pause to think that if Oswald was an asset, and I think he was an asset, and did certain missions, whatever you want to call them, that if he came across something that it would not be good for him to have knowledge of. You work for the agency. You're involved in some very sensitive operations, and you think you're okay because you're involved with them, you're doing your job, and then one day you wind up suicided, and it's because you got cleaned up. That's why I had asked her also about cleanup crews.
Well, you wonder why Ruby did it, really. I mean, why would he do that? Because he knows he's going to get caught and go to jail.
But can you not see? All right, now, how about the duality here? Oswald. Now, that's another thing I want to ask you about before we part. But Oswald gets told he's going to be involved in something. I mean, I wanted to ask Judyth about the scenario that has been presented by more than one or two researchers and those essentially who do not believe Oswald was a shooter at all, and that was Oswald's appearance in the break room, looking a little bit surprised when confronted by a supervisor in the depository, and a motorcycle cop who, with gun drawn, ran upstairs, and the story was, that's just Lee, and he looked like, huh? So if that is, that's why I wanted to ask her, because if he was going to thwart, and I'm not going to take it that literal to say that he was going to thwart the assassination that day, but may have known about it before.
Well, I don't think there was any way for him to thwart it.
No, I don't either. And like I said, she might have meant time, but on that particular day, he must have known what was shaking.
Well, he's probably the person who called in to the FBI, both in Miami and Chicago, warning that the president would be assassinated.
Yeah, that's right, because, I mean, he was in Tampa right before then, too. And somebody remarked to me, who was a young girl at the time, someone who I worked with at the library, and she said that she remembers that where they were all lining up the street to watch him go by, she couldn't believe the accessibility and his exposure. But, you look, I mean, she's like, 17 at the time, whatever, no big deal. And then he goes down to Miami, and that's when it apparently was thwarted, and then he goes off to Dallas. So, I mean, I'm sure that the professionals who were involved in the assassination knew they needed a couple of plans, A, B, and C. But my point is, here's Oswald now, not involved in the shooting, but knowing maybe what's going on, and the next thing he knows, boing, guess what? You're the one, you're the patsy, and he realizes, I've been screwed. And I wonder if there wasn't a promise to Ruby. Don't worry about it, Jack, do this, we'll get you off, no problem, blah, blah, blah. And then it was like, yeah, screw you, man. You know what I mean? And J.D. Tippett. Why was Tippett shot, really? I just found it interesting that Mellon called him a gun runner, but never explained anything further. And in a book that people can read online, The Taking of America 1, 2, 3, Tippett's referred to there as one of the drivers. I mean, whatever that means.
I hesitate to say this because I got attacked viciously for it on the JFK list. Some of the stuff I bring up here on the show, they just go apeshit over. Like, Tippett did look like JFK, and they. I know. What?
No, and they said that he wound up being the body.
Well, that's Morningstar. Unfortunately, Robert Morningstar was the person who propagated that. It doesn't mean it's not true, but the fact that Morningstar did it has sullied that idea.
Yeah, I think it has, but again, I think, and I hate to sound like this because I sound like a conspiratorial individual, but sometimes this shit goes too far, and it's time that somebody put a harness on it. And it's like, you know what? You make it just a little bit too confusing, a little too intricate. KISS. And I'm not into Occam's razor and all that other stuff because that's another, throwaway. But my point is, you can make this a little too confusing and get too much involved in it. And so what's the point? I don't know.
Well, I mean, he was killed for some reason, and there really isn't a.
Well, I know.
Other than him being in the perhaps being gay like Ruby and the rest of them, and being in their parties. I mean, why they didn't kill Shaw? They didn't kill a lot of other people that went to those parties. So why did they kill him?
It was only until I started doing stuff about the three massacres: Dunblane, Scotland, Port Columbine in Australia, and Port Arthur in Australia, and Columbine in Colorado, where there seems to be this presence of a cleanup crew. I don't mean to keep hammering this, but I think it's got to be understood as well that you've got black ops and black ops. And sometimes they take care of the people who are the real principals and executing a certain objective, mission. and then they get taken care of.
Well, this is what I think was going on in the area, the Ohio Valley with Mothman and all that. I think that these men in black were the cleanup crew.
All right, now what I wanted to ask you about also, what was the Oak Ridge deal? Now, I mean, you got the lab there, which is Spookland, but why was he there?
Judyth said he was picking up some nuclear material that they were going to use to lessen the resistance to the cancer. Knoxville again is where Osborne had his assassination team. I've got an informant, I guess you could call him, from Knoxville, who's been writing me lately, telling me some strange things. I may have mentioned it. Did I mention it before that he said all of Tennessee is owned by the British, all the coal mines? And he said they had the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, has an environmental side, and they have a production side or an energy side, and the two are supposedly separate. And the environmental side was claiming that they don't have the ability to regulate the coal mines in Tennessee because they don't know who owns them. And all they know is that it's in London. And they showed a map of the state, and he said that it looked like the whole state was owned by the same conglomerate. All the big open lands where they have forests and coal mines and everything. And this is a pattern in every state. I mean, you see that's the story about West Virginia, that it was the British who owned. And Kentucky, of course, the Queen has a big presence in Kentucky with the stable horses and Kentucky Derby and all that. Ohio clearly has some. But again, I want to go back. I looked just before I got on here. I looked up Massey because they're the biggest coal mining place in West Virginia, and they've just gotten bought out by Alpha Natural Resources. Prior to that, Massey was owned by Dutch Shell and Fluor out of Texas, which was originally a Swiss company, but now has headquarters in Dallas. And they got their big start by getting Aramco and Arco contracts. So that's the Rockefellers, basically. So Rockefellers probably own Massey, or the Queen does, or both. Now Alpha, the new owner of Massey, is made up of Brinks Coal. Brinks whatever. They have a coal division that was taken over or incorporated into Alpha. Alpha is a pretty new company. It just started in 2002, right after 9/11. So it's basically bringing together Brinks and First Reserve Corporation. First Reserve is out of Connecticut, Houston, and London. Connecticut, the Bushes; Houston, the Bushes; London, the Bushes. And guess who First Reserve bought in 2004? Dresser Industries, Dick Cheney's company, the one that has the assassination team supposedly built into it, and also cryptozoology, spies, and stuff. First Reserve also owns CHC Helicopter, which flies stuff to and from oil and coal sites. They probably got some nice black helicopters. They're out of the UK, Norway, Netherlands, Brazil, and Australia. So that sounds like a crown operation as well. And they also own Pride Drilling in Terra, which I've heard of before, but there's not much available on it. And Brand Services. Those are three innocuous sounding companies that probably are good sources of stuff if anybody wants to dig deep, into all these connections. I'm sure there's some stuff to be found there. Enterra is Enterra, and I think they're out of business now. So they like to keep changing these names, so that the information goes into the memory hole. Like, for instance, Enterra, Pride, and Brand, you can't get information on Wikipedia about them.
What a surprise.
And there probably aren't any websites even for them anymore. So you won't know, you can't, it's hard to go back and research who put these conglomerates together, but Alpha Natural is the biggest energy company there is now, pretty much, as far as coal goes.
All right, a real quick aside. Consider this, and we go back to saying that, think of America, and when it was developed, it was an enterprise from the crown. and there were land patents that were offered. My point is that if you read the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, the King drafts it. King George drafts the terms. If the UK lost, why are they drafting the terms? I mean, it was written by King George III, who also called himself, what was it, an arch-elector of the Holy Roman Empire. No, an arch-treasurer and elector of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, get this, though. Do you see anywhere in the history of the United States where we made a land purchase as we did with Louisiana or the Gadsden? Did we ever buy those lands from Britain? No. Did we seize them through the revolution? No. A revolution we did not win. So what does that leave us today?
It's like they're paying us back. They've been paying us back for 200 years for our, obstinance.
Well, that was the point. I mean, the whole thing was, look, we don't have to, look, first of all,
we're not going to get national health care. We're not going to get single payer like Canada or Australia or any of these other places until we fly on our knees and say, we're sorry.
They got us by they have an IV into us financially. That's my point. They are the ones who went ahead, and it was a commercial enterprise that they funded, and they wanted their due. And in a business deal, they have a right to ask for that. Now, we didn't seize it from them through the revolution. And one of the interesting things also is, and this is what the informer pointed out, when they first started drafting like the boundaries for the colonies, they extended their western perimeter. I mean, as I remember the I-Man telling me, because they would take, like, for instance, think about all the straight lines you have with Pennsylvania, North Carolina, right, Virginia. They would take them to the western coast, as if to say, this is all ours. Now that's a little bit hairy to take, but you'll see some maps where that shows that. So my whole point is, no, I mean, they've been sucking off us ever since the revolution. I mean, nobody wanted a central bank. And so what do we get? Oh, a central bank. Why? Because it was hooked into the Bank of England. So, I mean, it was like, what I'm saying, Andy, is that first...
That was what 1812 was about.
Well, that's another one, and he's supposedly going to come on again, and there's stuff I'd like to ask about that, because that war still cracked... I mean, I don't understand what that was about. But why do you mention that about the War of 1812?
Well, supposedly an effort was made to get us off of the Rothschild. They were printing our money or something, and we decided we were going to do our own, similar with JFK and Kennedy, or Lincoln.
Yes, there were all fiscal matters involved in that, and there's a possibility there, although some will say that the whole idea of Kennedy and the getting rid of the Federal Reserve, I don't know, or reprinting silver notes instead of the Federal Reserve notes. That's open to debate, and I don't know. I mean, I'd like to check it out. I just don't know.
The latest thing about JFK, though, as far as he goes, is that it wasn't that as much as it was him breaking up or going after the World Commerce Corporation, which was formed by British intelligence after the war. Stevenson, again, the same guy that was hanging out with David Rockefeller at trial, formed it with Donovan of the OSS.
That's right.
Oxner was involved. Alton Oxner, who Judyth was working for. It was registered in Panama, and it controlled world commerce. It was named World Commerce because it was controlling world commerce. And, one of these guys under Stevenson, Ogilvy, was, jumped off and became the scion of Madison Avenue. He became, the star of advertising and not just, so they weren't just controlling the shows like soap operas, they were controlling the advertising, accompanying the shows. Mm-hmm. And these are all British, spies doing it. He infiltrated the Gallup poll to get us into World War II. I mean, he took a job at the Gallup poll and then started framing questions and using data to sell the idea of us going to war to us, back to us. Not that we shouldn't have done it, but...
No, but the thing is, what this all speaks of is that we are a colony of the Crown, but just don't know it. And I mean, that's what I used to say to my friends. It's like, why do we get called into 2 world wars on the European continent we had nothing to do with? Well, Britain was our ally. I go, yeah, okay, what did they ever do for us? And so after them getting a rather bloodied nose in the Boer War, it was kind of clear they weren't going to be kicking ass too much militarily, so they called us in. And I'm sorry, but I think it's a really good example of Master Blaster in Thunderdome.
Well, that's why Obama's sent out the drones for the Queen in the Middle East, because when we signed the 1925 Seven Sisters Agreement to get the Saudi oil fields, the British only had supposedly 10% of that, and the Rockefellers had the rest. But see, over these past 75 years, until 2000, when we had realized, we needed to reinvade, to keep it, somebody needed to reinvade instead of renegotiating that contract. Cheney was definitely involved in that process. BP started buying up all the old Standard Oil companies. Something weird's going on. It's like now the British have they have a way bigger share of the oil fields over there than the 10% that they were reputed to have back then. It's way bigger, and in fact, it may be the vast majority of it now.
And also one other thing, and Joan Vion had pointed this out, and we had done a show years ago, and she just recently passed. And Joan Vion was making the point that when the Brits went ahead and, quote, gave freedom to their former colonies, decolonized, they did it in a trade-off for, and of course this isn't above the table, but a trade-off for their votes in the UN, so that the UN would largely be affected by votes largely still belonging to Britain.
Well, there were 54 countries mentioned in the articles about the Queen last week, that they control 54 countries. Well, that's how many had to vote. Mm-hmm. Well, 16 directly have her as their head. She is the head of 16 countries, and I don't know what you call her in relation to the other 54. But I guess those are islands and different places protected.
Yes.
But if you consider all the countries they control, or Canada, Australia, us, and mostly, that's the bigger part of the world, resource-wise.
I won't dwell on this, but if I were to say to you, after the Holy Roman Empire, can you name another empire that somewhat approximated the greatness of that one, and whose likes we've never seen again?
Yeah, you really can't. And in fact, and it's not just those countries, but they extended into India.
Yes.
China.
My point
was, and some say Russia with the financing of Lenin by Western bankers.
That's right. But my point is, it's the British. The only other empire as far-flung and as powerful were the Brits.
And that's where all our jobs have went. That's the other thing. China and India. All of our tech jobs are going to India because they speak English. China's got all of our manufacturing now that used to be done in the Ohio Valley. So they just sold us down the river. But they're still digging coal. They're still blowing up mountaintops all over Appalachia and giving everybody cancer. I mean, it's unbelievable what they're doing now in the Appalachians.
You can argue that we have been colonized again, and we have been. We've been colonized. I mean, look at us. They're going to turn us into a third world country with an ass-kicking military to fight the fights that they can't, and they're not done using them yet. They're raping us for everything that we've had, jobs, money, property, the whole 9 yards. But they'll keep us around for one more bloodbath. That I have no doubt about. So, yeah, I mean, I understand why you would say what you did, and the influence here is because we're very much still part of. Well,
I noticed. I also read this Eddowes book. Michael Eddowes wrote a book on Oswald called The Oswald File. I wanted to check it out because they had a picture of in there of Oswald's library card, which has the name Jack Bowen on it, which is probably Osborne or Crisman. It could be Fred Crisman, because Crisman was also using the same alias as Osborne of Bowen. So maybe Oswald was meeting Crisman, one of our men in black from the Woody Derberger case in Oak Ridge. But Eddowes, is a Brit, and and I don't know anything about the guy. My reading the intro where he says that when the Cuban Missile Crisis was occurring, he was sitting with a Soviet admiral having tea. I'm thinking, okay, so this guy's probably a spook. He's written this book that makes some good points. I mean, the basic idea of the book is that the Oswald that went over is not the one who came back. And it's the same. Right. Well, the We Were Controlled book by Lincoln Lawrence, he says that the Oswald went over and got mind controlled and got an implant and everything. So he was different. He was a different Oswald. It was the same Oswald, but he was controlled. Well, Edo says, no, this was a Soviet agent who had plastic surgery to look like Oswald. And this was a question I wanted to ask Judyth but didn't get to ask, but I asked it later on her group. And was the Oswald that came back the one that went over?
Right.
It was the one you fell in love with, the original Oswald, and she thinks it was. And I think she's probably right, because I found a reference, as synchronicity would have it, that the Oswald in Minsk had a New York accent, which would be the real Oswald. And this the source on that was Robert E. Doran, D-O-R-A-N. There's a lot of, but this Edo's guy, I think, was trying to, the cover-up proves the crime. And here he is writing a book basically to blame it all on the Soviets. That's the gist of the book, I think. So if British intelligence did pull the trigger, it would make sense that they would come out with half guys writing books trying to blame it on the Soviets. But this doesn't make any sense. Why would the Soviets hook up a patsy? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It's pointless. Pointless exercise. He didn't actually kill Kennedy, but Eddowes tries to say he did kill Kennedy. So there you go. That's the cover-up proves the crime. Why would somebody with that much knowledge, who knew so much about international affairs, write a book like that? Unless it was to muddy the waters. Of course.
What's interesting also is I just looked at this corresponding with a listener about FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, and the story that Prouty told about Roosevelt's son Elliot approaching Stalin, I don't know, some years after the death of FDR, and he supposedly asked Stalin, why did you not let my mother, I guess the mother was supposed to go to some funeral, I can't remember. I read it recently, but the whole point of it was this. Stalin told Elliot Roosevelt, he said, your father was poisoned. He said, well, who would do that? He goes, Churchill's gang. He goes, and they still try to kill me the same way. And later on, of course, he was poisoned. It was blamed on Khrushchev and others who were going to ascend to power. But the problem that he had with Eleanor Roosevelt, this is Stalin, he wanted Gromyko to attend the funeral, but to be able to have a viewing of FDR where Gromyko would have looked for telltale signs of a poisoning rather than the stroke or whatever that supposedly took FDR's life. And Eleanor said no. And because she rebuffed Stalin's legate, Gromyko, the payback was, I forget for what it was, but that she couldn't go over there. And that's what he told Elliot. And that story comes from Prouty. So there you go. I mean, once again, Churchill's gang did it. And actually, I have no doubt about that. I would be surprised if FDR was off also. He might not have had the balls to drop the 2 bombs. He just might not have had that in him.
My dad claimed that he had worked there at Hyde Park when we were visiting there once. He said he had flown planes there, and he wouldn't elaborate at all on it. So, maybe they just took my dad out because his name was Colvin, because first of all, he was working for them. He was working for Carbide, which means British ownership. They had him. I mean, and they probably saw his name and thought, is this guy's related? He's from upstate New York. He's related to that Verplank dude that screwed us up when we were trying to buy New York State. And now we don't have New York State because of these freaking Colvins. Let's get rid of this dude. I mean, it could have been as simple as that. Oh, they have long memories.
Oh, they definitely do. Well, I mean, that's an interesting dynamic that took place in that area, of which even my own home state of Jersey was involved in. And I mean, and that's also part of, I guess, the the allegory of the Headless Horseman, because it was the Dutch and the British, going back and forth to try to hold on to the Hudson Valley, New York and such. We all know how that wound up. But as you know, or you may remember, Andy, because, I drove my motorcycle up around there a lot. I love the Hudson Valley. But on that East Bank, man, that was some kind of a neighborhood. You've got, you got Roosevelt, which sounds somewhat Dutch, I'm assuming. Rockefeller is there.
I think they are Dutch Jews, actually.
Vanderbilt, Van Cortlandt, Rensselaer, all on the East Bank, and it stops just about up around the east side of what would be Albany. But interestingly, that would be Kinderhook and that area, and the first American-born president was from there, Dutch, Van Buren, Martin Van Buren. Now, the trick to this question was all previous presidents were born in this country as colonies, right? They were not American-born. Van Buren was the first born on American soil when it was the United States. All previous presidents were not, U.S. citizens. And so it was Van Buren at the very north end of the Dutch-controlled Hudson Valley. And we had the remnant of that in New Jersey. It was all over the place. It was heavily Dutch. So,
well, what is it with Royal Dutch Shell then? Is there some cozy relationship between the Dutch and the British? Because it's 60% Dutch and 40% British ownership. Can you? I had a bit of an argument, I guess, with Bruce Bigford, my famous artist friend. He couldn't wrap his head around the whole George Washington being a British, I don't know if you want to call it stooge or whatever, because it's so the opposite of what we're told.
Of course. Well, there you go.
Could you do it in a paragraph, like explain one more time, like, because I know that Washington did the first thing he did was he created federal states instead of just
districts,
and the states their own thing.
He made districts. That's right. That's one thing.
How did that help I know it helped the British. It could have helped them by giving them easier control, right?
I just think that was for a further day. To this day, and we see that revisited when we went into the post-Civil War era with the Reconstruction Acts and the reinstitution of martial law in the South. Again, we went through these military districts. Florida, and I don't want to get too far afield, I understand, but Florida, it was like crazy because Florida, and two other states, they were brought back in the Union peaceably, everybody's friends again, but they didn't want to pass the 13th and 14th Amendments. They were not going to ratify them. And that's another whole story about the 13th and the 14th. One freed the blacks. The 14th is what some people say, you freed the blacks with the 13th, you enslaved everybody with the 14th. That's another long story. But where I'm going with this is it's such a crazy situation because when those states wouldn't ratify them, hell, man, the federal government came back down and reinstituted martial law, and we were back underneath that kind of rule. And that's one of the things down here that the Southerners are most pissed about. Forget losing the Civil War. They didn't like the way they were treated with the carpetbaggers and the Reconstruction Act. So anyway, again, the point of the states being also districts was reinforced. Now, what I'll do is I'll send you a paragraph, but you always sound like a nut when you try to get all through this stuff in one, in like 8 sentences. What I'll do is I'll give the cites and the references, and he can look for himself. But remember something also, he was the first realtor in the United States when he was doing his surveying for the Crown. And secondly, after we won our supposed independence, he calls out the federal troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And then also, I believe, with the Shays Rebellion, when the states realized that they got the Articles of Confederation thrown out for the Constitution, which they weren't asking for.
Well, the tricky part is he got all this land from the British generals, and that's evident in the signs that you see in the Kanawha Valley, all the lands he owned. It doesn't say that he took them from the British. He was granted the lands. So if he's fighting them, why is it? It'll say it's a gift. Even some of them say he was gifted the land. Or is that just British mumbo jumbo? did he really take the land and they're just trying to make it look good for the British, or did they just give it to him because he was their man? He was helping them out, right. The whole charade.
Without belaboring this conversation, I'm not ducking the question, but I will say this. What we've done is we have nearly deified the founding fathers, which I hate that word. You ain't my father, man. The framers.
Well, the Nazi Party had him up they had George Washington up instead of Hitler when they had their big rallies in New York. So,
well, when they made the Constitution, those who, like Patrick Henry, went along with it, but then had something to say behind a backhand. And he goes, we have just now tilted toward monarchy. The Constitution allows completely for dictatorial rule by the president. I mean, if you got EOs and you got an Emergency War Powers Act, forget the Constitution, don't need it, don't give a crap about the other two branches, and there you go. So when Washington supposedly refused the office of monarch or king, well, what difference does it matter? He was put in that situation under the Constitution. They just called him president. And, of course, your friend will have a very hard time swallowing the fact that the Constitution is a complete canard for we the little people, as opposed to we, capital W, the big people, capital P, which you see in the Constitution. That isn't just a stylistic flair at that time. That was telling you that we, the big people, are not you, the little people. And the Constitution is to save our ass with the crown, and that's another whole long story. And he can listen to it. You know, if I get this interview going with the I-Man in Montgomery, which I'm hoping for a 2-hour question and answer, we can do it all there. It's not that simple to say. I would just say that he would not be in error to understand that the portraits that are painted literally about our presidents and our founding fathers are not that close to the truth. And that's why to this day we embrace this freaking myth so that anything we do has got to be okay because, like, we're America and, you know, Washington and all that shit. You know, I mean, it's just the story. I wrote to my brother-in-law the other day. I said, you know, my other one, the problem with Americans is they've been propagandized into believing they can't be propagandized. Thank you. That's it. No, I mean, you laugh at TASS and Pravda. Oh, you guys got managed news. What the hell do you think you got here? All right, and by the way, I just want to add this little side note to this, because it always pops up, like I said. You know your buddy Metternich? Yeah, Metterlink. In September 1874, he was sent to the Jesuit College of St. Barbet, where works of the French Romantics were scorned, and only plays on religious subjects were permitted. His experiences at the school influenced his distaste for the Catholic Church and organized religion. Does it shock you?
Well, is that true? Or is that just a cover story?
No, that's his life. He wound up going into a Jesuit college in 1874.
Yeah, but it makes it sound like he rejected it all. What if he didn't? And that's just a cover story, and everything he did was, you know, part of the Jesuit plan. I don't know.
Well, what is the short story in which he depicts the assassination of a head of state?
Well, it looks like, you know, somebody just had that story in their mind when they thought, how can we frame this Kennedy hit in some, you know, Masonic revelation of the method way?
Yeah, in a ritual, yes.
Let's have a Grassy Knoll. Let's have a guy named Alec from Russia with love.
Well, you know, as much as some people denigrate Downard, I think, well, anyway, that's their right to do. But, I mean, that whole killing of Kennedy seems to have been, really, I mean, in the ritualistic method of the killing of Biff. By the three that set upon him because they didn't get the master word or whatever. A head wound. Same thing with Osiris, a head wound. Yeah, and I mean a triangulated shooting. I mean that thing almost, and with all the celebrities that were down there, in a sense, I'm saying, you know, Hoover, Nixon, Bush. I mean that was like, it was like a gathering of some kind of beast. It's like sitting in the stands and watching a hit you know is going to happen. I mean, can you dig that? I mean, do we even know that they weren't watching this thing on some kind of closed circuit? I mean, like what we kind of get from Sunbush about the first hit of the building. So he was watching it before he came into the classroom. I mean, can you imagine these characters were someplace knocking back a couple of, bourbons and watching this shooting? I mean, can you imagine? It's like the freaking Coliseum.
At Offutt Air Force Base, where Chrisman held court, apparently.
At Offutt, yeah. And where does Bush wind up? Offutt. And what was going on in Omaha? Buffett's last soiree, these yearly parties he threw. Oh, what about that? And Goldman Sachs' head is there while, her underlings are being slaughtered. Jeez. I mean,
the other thing we talked about with Judyth was the Maddox thing, Alvin Maddox, not to be confused with Alvis of the Mothman story.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask you about that. All right.
Alvin, although they may be related, I'm wondering if Alvin isn't related to Alvis or General Maddox, who married into the Japanese aristocracy, worked for Bell Helicopter, probably connected somehow, some way to the Odessa. But so Maddox, and this stuff it just popped up in the conversation, and it's like Judyth, reads some of my stuff that I put up, and she knows what my story's about, and I know what her story's about. And so we just sort of, started rolling and didn't really have time to explain it. But the Maddox story to me is important, and I think she thinks it's important. She seemed to think, though, that Maddox is, not a bad guy, but he did happen to be present when Buddy Walters, who was going to be, I don't want to say the star witness, but he was going to be one of Garrison's major witnesses. He saw somebody pick up an extra bullet in Dealey Plaza, took it from him because he was, a cop. And he was going to say, yeah, we found this extra bullet, and this proves the single bullet theory is a lie. And then he ends up dead on the job in the presence of Al Maddox. Now, to me, that's a little bit makes me wonder about Al Maddox, especially since Maddox was involved with Ruby, going to the jailhouse and getting Ruby's statements about having cancer injected into him, which isn't really something a conspirator would do. So I can kind of see where Judyth's coming from. One of the real conspirators probably wouldn't drop that bomb about the cancer injections, because it might bolster other parts of the story, including her part of the story. What Ferry and Oswald were working on, because they were helping her make the cancer. They didn't know anything about science. Well, Ferry did, but Oswald was just helping out, probably watching the situation and reporting back to the Navy or whoever he was reporting to.
There was just a lack of background in that.
Yeah.
And I mean,
is that not a familiar name to people, right? The Maddox, or Walters and Maddox?
Maddox, as it relates to you, goes back to what you had said about the Mothman and the whole Manson thing. All right? The names, Keel mentioned them both. He would mention Alvin, being this JFK guy, and then mentioned Alvis being also a cop in the same area of northern Texas, near Dallas. Al and Buddy, but they were set up. It sounds like they were set up, and Walters ends up dead, and Maddox only gets a shot in the foot. So it makes me wonder about him. But, why didn't they take him out too? Lastly, let's do this. What happened to Baker not long after she concluded the interview with you?
Well, she doesn't want to make it out to be more than it was, but there was glass in her food right after she did the interview with me and you. She had the lunch with her family, and there was some finely ground glass and some larger pieces in her food, which basically started bleeding while she was eating, and went to the hospital. And I guess is okay, and was back in action the next day.
All right, and it was with our doing the interview. The point is that she has been obviously on guard because after the book came out.
She mentioned some other incidents, but wouldn't say what they were. Okay. She said that wasn't the only one.
All right. Yeah, so that she's got to be careful as she goes across Canada doing this book tour appearances. So, all right, there you go. And, of course, what I mentioned to you was ground glass was used in the attempted assassination of James Buchanan during his inaugural party, which did claim the lives, I think, about 12 people or so. So it's not an unknown form of assassination, let's just say. All right, brother, you ready to call it a day? All right, listen, Andy, thanks for being with us and clearing it up. I think that'll take care of it. Appreciate it.
A warning to survivors. This book contains information that will trigger you. Give it to your deprogrammer rather than try to read it yourself, unless you have a thoroughly reintegrated personality. Some of this information is wrong and can be harmful to you. Inevitably, it is impossible to weed out the triggers, since programming varies from person to person, from handler to handler. Thus, know that if you ever have been programmed, you may be triggered by information in this book. In order to protect us all from cross-pollination or contamination, certain specific but trivial information is deliberately false and has been planted as a sort of tag. Thus, if survivors start coming up with the planted information, we will know that there's a probability that they have been corrupted by this book. The author, editors, or publisher take no responsibility for any triggering that may occur.